even if he observes God, even if God directly reveals himself to him, he would still refuse to believe.
Cultural Christian identifies with certain aspects of Christianity, such as the good works of Jesus, but rejects the spiritual aspects required to be a biblically defined Christian. Hello everybody, I want to welcome you to another edition of the Uncensored Pilgrims. I'm Marty McLain along with the irrepressible
Paul Price.
and we are here today to talk about Richard Dawkins.
Richard Dawkins, one of our favorite guys.
Do you have a Richard Dawkins dartboard?
No, but that'd be an interesting, investment.
Yes, he's not a fan of creationists.
So, and let me just mention too, I believe we're up to, what is this? I think now episode 56 that we're recording.
We're in the 50s.
Getting up there.
Yes, we're middle-aged.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's so you know. If
you would know a little bit about that.
I would know about that. You're exactly right, and I feel it every day. But if you want to check us out, you can always go on any platform where they have podcasts. We're also, I think we get our most traffic on YouTube.
Yeah, and guess what? Even if you don't listen to us on YouTube, do us a favor, go on YouTube and throw us a subscription, why don't you?
Yeah, just subscribe. Just humor us.
Just humor us.
Yeah,
How about that?
We're humored easily.
Yeah.
They could probably tell that.
Yeah, definitely. And a like even.
Yeah, see, we all like to be liked, I reckon. So just give us a like or something, thumbs up.
We've recently, thankfully, to our small but devoted listenership audience, we're over 200 subscribers now, which,
We'll
it's
call
not
it a mini milestone.
A mini milestone, very many.
But we're still in the basement.
Yes, still in the basement. Still exerting minimal effort on the podcast.
Yes.
So.
Yes, but who knows? Who knows what will happen?
Who knows what the future may hold?
Okay, well, we're going to talk about Richard Dawkins, and of course, he is what is known as one of the new atheists. Although he's an old new atheist, he's not
on the younger side at this point.
No, they came to being, really in the early 21st century. The four of the guys, you said they were also referred to as the four horsemen.
Yeah, they call them the four horsemen, I think, of the new atheism or something along those lines.
And we're talking about Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, and Christopher Hitchens. Now, I know Hitchens is dead.
Yes.
He passed away, and he passed away firm in his unbelief, if I'm not mistaken.
I'm sure all of these guys will.
And he was...
hopefully not, but yeah.
He was, and he was being prayed for. I mean, he had one of these illnesses, if I'm not mistaken, that, it took him a little while to die. So he was dying, and he knew he was dying. So he had time to prepare.
We all have that, and it's called the curse.
It's called the curse, but then when you have an actual prognosis,
yes,
that you've got probably X amount of time, and you still don't get your house in order,
then you know that person's really hardened, right? I mean, it's just like there was another atheist. I'm struggling to remember his name now, but there was a well-known atheist. He's dead now. I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but he was a well-known atheist like one of these guys.
Yes.
And he actually had a near-death experience. And he even had an experience of where he said he felt like what he saw was the administrator of the universe.
Administrator, oh.
And yet, after that, he still remained an atheist. So,
okay.
Can you imagine that? Having a near-death experience and coming up against what you perceive to be the administrator of the universe.
It's an odd way to describe God.
Well, I think it's a way of avoiding to use the word God, right?
Yeah, no deity reference there.
Yeah. So some of these guys, and Richard Dawkins being one of them, because you may get to this later, I'm not sure, but more recently, Richard Dawkins has gone on record saying that there is no piece of evidence that would ever convince him that God exists. Even God revealing himself directly to him would not convince him, because he would just conclude from that he had a hallucination.
Yeah, he's delusional.
Yeah.
It is the God delusion to him, isn't it?
So it's a delusion by definition. Even if he observes God, even if God directly reveals himself to him, he would still refuse to believe.
Yes. Now,
And at least he's honest enough to admit that.
yes. You can say he is an honest man.
Yeah, yeah.
He's pretty forthright. He's honest. He's honest in his unbelief.
I think he's been a thorn in the side of atheism for a long time because of his honesty, his brutal honesty. So, like, for example, the politically correct thing for atheists to say about the theory of evolution, for example, is that the theory of evolution is supposedly agnostic with respect to religion. So, theoretically, according to the party line, if you will, being an evolutionist is not supposed to have anything to do with whether you're a Christian or not. I think the biologos people would all want to say that. People like Francis Collins, people of that ilk, would have you believe that there's just no connection. Like, you can be a Christian evolutionist, you can be whatever, and technically you can, but to claim that there's no connection there is very misleading.
I don't get the theistic evolutionist crowd like Francis Collins and others.
Right.
I don't see, God oversees the process of evolution. We could do a whole podcast on that.
There could be a God who did that, but it wouldn't be the God of the Bible.
Yes, because it's explicitly stated differently than theistic evolution. So, we're not theistic evolution.
The point I was getting there, Richard Dawkins was too honest for his own good, and he admitted and made a big deal out of the fact that he thought accepting evolution led him to atheism.
Of course.
Well, you're not supposed to say that, because you're supposed to say, well, no, you need to accept evolution, and that's perfectly fine if you want to keep your religious beliefs, but just accept evolution.
Yeah, it's almost like this is the Grail. This is the Holy Grail. You have to
accept evolution.
You've got to
Whatever else you do is fine. It's kind of like in ancient Rome, remember, you had to burn incense
and
say
be whatever
Caesar
else you
is
wanted
Lord.
to, but you had to do that for Caesar.
You had to say Caesar is Lord, and it didn't matter what else you said.
Yeah.
As long as you're willing to say that, it doesn't matter what else. And that's kind of the way our society is with evolution.
You and LGBTQ.
That too.
Yes.
But you have to say evolution is true, and no matter what else you say besides that, it doesn't matter.
Yeah. And, it's to me, it's a big cop-out. I see the folks that have gone the way of theistic evolution, and I'm thinking, man, what a sellout. That's just my personal opinion.
Yep.
That's,
that would be my take on it as well. That's not to denigrate people. Like, I know there are people who are sincerely misled, and they really have been duped into thinking that you can mix these two things together. When I was very young, I grew up thinking that just because that's what the media taught. That's what the movies taught. So, as a kid and as a middle schooler, I kind of just believed in evolution and creation and didn't really question it much. But I think you come to a certain point and you really have to see that the major contradiction there.
And in evolution on the way out, even with the thinking man scientists,
that's a little bit more tough. That's a little bit more tough because, in a way, it is crumbling as a theory. It's so far from matching the reality that we find.
Yeah.
That it is crumbling, but at the same time, these people that have rejected God by no means are going to accept God. So
they're looking for another way out.
They're looking for a different way out. They're in the process of coming up with new theories. They're in the process of maybe looking to panspermia. The idea that life was seeded here by asteroids or aliens or
even
whatever.
Dawkins gives reference to that in that movie.
Yes, in Expelled, he mentions that. So, yes, in a way, evolution is crumbling if you take it in the old Darwinian sense where it's totally unguided and there's no help from the outside. That's crumbling because it's not possible. It's too obvious that it's not possible.
It requires a lot of faith.
It requires too much faith, yes.
It really
and there's
does.
Too much evidence that flies in the face of it.
Yeah.
So you get authors like the Steele et al. Paper that came out a few years ago, where they suggested asteroids seeding viruses that attached into the DNA of life and increased the DNA of our life in spurts. That was a paper that came out with a whole slew of co-authors, like maybe 30 or more co-authors signed on to that paper.
Wow.
And of course, it's still considered to be a fringe idea, but it's gaining a lot of steam because it's just too obvious to too many people. They can't keep the wool over your eyes any longer.
Yeah, it's like, come on, man, the gig's up.
So they're going to have to come up with something, and this seems to be the best thing they can come up with so far.
Well,
They're not going to turn to the Bible, I can guarantee that.
No, they're not, unless the Holy Spirit draws them. They've got to make that decision, and they've got to, they just don't want to.
Unless it's, for example, like Dr. John Sanford, who is one of the co-author or the co-inventors of the gene gun, one of the earliest forms of plant genetic engineering. He had, but usually what has to happen is what happened to him, which is you have a come to Jesus moment in your life that then opens your eyes to be able to reassess the evidence that you were deliberately blinding yourself to before. It doesn't generally happen that just, nothing changes in your life and one day you just have an aha moment and you realize, evolution can't be true.
Yeah.
Usually there's always a spiritual component because
this is
spiritual battle.
Atheism is a spiritual decision.
It's a spiritual decision, yes.
Yes. Well, here's the thing about Dawkins and the other three horsemen.
Yeah, Dennett, Harris, and Hitchens.
As they, you said used to be you really didn't make a crossover with religion when it came to atheism. But they did. They attacked religion.
Yeah.
Is that what you're saying?
Well, I'm saying Richard Dawkins in particular would openly admit that belief in evolution leads people away from religion and toward atheism.
Okay.
And that was, a taboo thing for atheists to say because they wanted people to just accept evolution and think that it's not going to have any impact on your religion.
That's kind of that's kind of like the road that a lot of people take. They don't think about it after that.
And like you said, it's very similar to the way that that we're being told we should just accept LGBTQ. Mm-hmm. It doesn't matter if you're a Christian, you can be an accepting and inclusive Christian, but the important thing is accept LGBTQ.
Yes. And that's what they want us to do, but we're not going to do it. But here's the thing this one writer says about the new atheist. He says, quote, "The new atheists agree that while religion may have been a byproduct of certain human qualities that prove important for survival, religion itself is not necessarily a beneficial social and cultural phenomenon on balance at present. Indeed, three of the new atheists, Harris, Dawkins, and Hitchens, are quite explicit in their moral condemnation of religious people on the ground that religious beliefs and practices have had significant and predominantly negative consequences." So think about that. They claim that religion has had negative consequences. Now, these guys are raised in a Christian culture, right? Dawkins is British.
And keep in mind, I think these guys really picked up steam and started advancing this claim in the wake of 9/11.
Yeah, and they were
and then they were able to point to this and say, see, this
Islam extremism.
This is what religion does. They didn't say this is what Islam does. They said this is what religion does.
Well, here's what Richard Dawkins did a couple of months ago in an interview. And I went back, I watched the interview. He says, quote, "I call myself a cultural Christian. I'm not a believer, but there's a distinction between being a believing Christian and being a cultural Christian. I love hymns and Christmas carols, and I sort of feel at home in the Christmas ethos. We in the UK are a Christian country in that sense." Now, he also said that he's, quote, "horrified to see Islamic holidays and mosques taking the place of Christian feasts and cathedrals in Europe." He said, quote, "If I had to choose between Christianity and Islam, I'd choose Christianity every single time. It seems to me to be a fundamentally decent religion in a way that I think Islam is not."
Even that is an interesting kind of evolution of his position, isn't it?
It's extremely evolutionary.
Yeah, it's evolutionary. And
what's happening is he sees...
And that's not politically correct either, by the way.
Right.
A lot of atheists are going to be mad that he said that.
Oh, yeah, I can imagine, because he sees Islam overtaking England and Western Europe.
Yeah.
I mean, the mayor of London's a Muslim, he's been reelected one or 2 or 3 times, I think.
Yeah, but here's what Dawkins doesn't seem to grasp. The reason why the Islamic stuff is taking over the Christian stuff in Europe is because these Muslims actually believe.
Mm-hmm.
They're not quote-unquote cultural Muslims that just want to go to mosque on Ramadan. They actually believe.
Yeah.
And that's going to win out over a quote-unquote cultural Christianity where you don't really believe it's true, but you just do it as a tradition. True belief is going to win out over cultural tradition every time.
Yes.
Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, I mean, it's a cultural tradition.
You know what? I bet Jesus himself would say, I would rather have...
Spew you out of my mouth?
Yeah, I would rather have a true Muslim than a fake Christian. Wouldn't you say Jesus would agree with that statement?
That's a pretty heavy statement you got there, big guy.
I mean, I'm not saying that you can become saved as a Muslim, but I am saying that Jesus would prefer a true Muslim over a fake Christian any day.
Yeah, here's what, there's a website called Guide Questions. Here's what they say about cultural Christianity. Cultural Christianity is more social than spiritual. A cultural Christian identifies with certain aspects of Christianity, such as the good works of Jesus, but rejects the spiritual aspects required to be a biblically defined Christian.
Yeah.
Unquote. So, it's like they like the product.
They like the...
but they don't like they like the fruit, but not the root.
Exactly.
That's what some people say.
Yeah, and the thing is, though, you can't have one without the other.
You can't have the fruit without the root.
And it's weeks and weeks ago, maybe months ago, I don't remember when we talked about it, but we talked about Christian nationalism.
Yeah.
And one of the things that the Christian nationalists are big on is promoting cultural Christianity as a good thing.
Yeah.
Because what they're saying is, look, we're not saying you shouldn't be saved, but having cultural Christians is better than having cultural pagans.
Yeah.
That's what they say, and they're right in that respect.
You better believe it every time.
They're right, but the problem is, you cannot have the fruit without the root.
Yeah.
Cultural Christianity came into being because of true believers.
Exactly.
You cannot maintain cultural Christianity without those true believers.
Because there's going to be a vacuum that will be created, and something's going to fill that vacuum.
Yeah.
Maybe some type of secular, maybe some type of secular ideology, or maybe Islamic.
Yeah, and that whatever's going to fill that vacuum is going to be composed of true believers in something.
You better believe it. And the people that are the militant LGBTQ folks,
yeah,
they believe what they're backing.
Yeah.
I mean, they're all in. Now,
I mean,
crazy.
And this goes back to one of the first things, like when we began our podcast over a year ago. One of the things I brought up was that essay by what was the guy's name? I always forget his name, but he wrote an essay about the cycles of empire, the fate of empire, I think it was called. And he talked about how empires rise and fall, and when they're in that state of falling, that last cycle, that last part of the cycle, they lose all faith in what it was that made them great to begin with.
Yeah,
they are no longer true believers.
Yeah.
And they inevitably get overrun by people who are true believers in something else. Mm-hmm. And that's what we're seeing.
I mean, we're being overrun by secularism. We're being overrun by these folks that... I think there's more to it. I think there's a spiritual aspect to what's going on as well that's really dark and sinister.
Yeah.
I
well, there always has been.
Yeah.
I mean, we've been fighting that spiritual battle the whole time. So, this cycle that he was talking about isn't purely naturalistic. It's, there's a spiritual component of all that. But yeah, when you're no longer true believers and all you are is a cultural Christian, that is like building your house on the sand, right? Mm-hmm. It will not survive the storm. So,
well, here's what this one guy says, and I listened to some folks talking about Richard Dawkins, and it seems like they all referred to a guy named Tom Holland. Now, I was not familiar with Tom Holland, other than the guy that plays Spider-Man. But this is another Tom Holland.
I don't know either one, so I'm going to be
he's
fresh on this.
He's an Oxford-trained historian who wrote a book, Dominion, The Making of the Western Mind. Now, he was trained, he was raised by his mom and dad. His mom was a devout Anglican, and his father was an atheist. And he grew up, he liked reading the Bible and the stories, but then, of course, he strayed from the faith and really went in a very secular direction. But then he came to a realization as he was, studying, what makes civilization great. And it says in this one article written about it, he said, quote, this is what somebody writes about him, quote, as he entered midlife, Holland became increasingly aware of the vast different moral assumptions that governed the modern Western world and the ancient Greco-Roman world. Where the Roman world brutalized and oppressed the weak, the contemporary Western world deferred to and cared for the weak. Not perfectly, of course, but at least in ideal. No one in ancient Rome played the victim card, because victims were not admired, only despised. In the Greco-Roman world, might made right. Power was for the self-protection and self-promotion of the powerful. Generosity was only extended with a view of reciprocity. Okay, so he observes that about the ancient world, and then he comes to this point. He says, however, okay, quote, Holland's quest to answer this question resulted in dominion. Throughout his work, Holland attempts to answer a singular question about power. How did the totalizing and draconian power of the Greco-Roman world become the liberating and redeeming power of the modern Western world? Holland walks his reader through more than 2,500 years of Western history, from Athens in the 5th century BC to the present day, and his answer, unexpected for one of Holland's liberal atheistic orientation, unexpected even to himself, he admits, is Jesus on the cross. Christianity, Holland writes, began a revolution that has as its molten heart the image of a God dead on the cross.
Absolutely.
And that's something. Now, here's what Holland says about Richard Dawkins. And several of these people would quote from Holland, is that, now I'm going to paraphrase it, is that Richard Dawkins, all these years, he's been out on a limb with a saw, and he's been sawing that limb off.
Yeah.
And that limb's Christianity.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden he's been sawing, and all of a sudden he realizes he's about to saw that limb off that tree, and he looks down at the ground, and he realizes he's about to be separated from what's been holding him up.
And now all of a sudden he wants that limb.
He wants that limb to stay intact. But he's been sawing on that limb all these years. He's been seeking to undermine and destroy Christianity all these years, and all of a sudden he's starting to realize he's been the beneficiary of Christianity. And he knows that if Islam were to overtake Great Britain, that he would not enjoy the rights and the freedoms that he has under a nation that was shaped by the Judeo-Christian worldview.
Yeah,
and,
exactly.
I mean, he knows. I mean, they'll take him up to the top of a building, put him in a chair, tie him up, and shove him off the building.
Sure, why not? Yeah.
I mean, some pretty vicious things happen when you go to Islamic control and Sharia law.
I mean, look what they tried to do to people just for making a cartoon that lampooned Muhammad, right?
Salman Rushdie.
Yeah.
Rushdie, or what? Over when he did, was he in Amsterdam? Or
I think it was somewhere in Scandinavia, wasn't it?
Somewhere in that
I don't
area.
know.
It was in Northern Europe, I think. And he drew that cartoon, and they finally got to him, but I don't think they killed him. But he was in hiding for years.
Yeah, but that was when he wasn't even in their country, right?
Yeah, he was not in their country.
So imagine what it would be like if you were living under that.
In Germany, this past week, there was a guy that got stabbed. They had a video of him getting stabbed out in the open, out in a public square, and he was a critic of Islam.
Yeah.
And he gets, so you know that there are certain rights and certain benefits that you have enjoyed in a culture that has been shaped by Christianity. And if you go to some of these other places, look at the cultures that have been shaped by, I don't know, let's say communism.
Yeah.
I mean, Xi knows everything you do.
Yeah.
They have you under 24-hour surveillance.
Yeah, and it's getting to be that way here in this country too now, unfortunately.
Yeah, and so you think, all these people want to badmouth, Christian culture and all this stuff, and they want to undermine it. And what happens is that you realize that a lot of our legal system has been shaped.
Yep.
The work ethic.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so much in our culture and our society that is shaped by a Judeo-Christian understanding of who God is and what that means to society and how people are to live their lives. It doesn't mean that everyone's a believer, but there are certain cultural norms or expectations, and now that's changing. Obviously, I mean, when the sexual outlook and the sexual ethics and all that's coming in now that's infringing upon people's rights.
Yeah.
That's infringing upon the basics of family, of building blocks of society, and that's changing things in a way that people I don't think they really want it to change like that, but they can't help themselves.
Yeah. And I've also talked before about Friedrich Nietzsche.
Mm-hmm.
We talked about him a couple weeks ago.
He went mad and died.
That's true. Some people claim he had syphilis, but at the end of the day,
did not end well.
Yeah, it didn't end well for him. And Phil Fernandez says he was the most consistent atheist who ever lived because he died insane. And
that's really good. I like that.
But he was a brilliant thinker.
Mm-hmm.
More brilliant than most atheists today, because he understood that what the atheists are trying to do is that they're trying to throw God off a bridge, but they're trying to empty his pockets before they do it.
That's a good way to put it.
They're trying to empty God's pockets, and what do they want? They want to take morality, they want to take generosity, helping the weak, kindness, meekness, gentleness, self-control.
Don't work that way.
They want to take all that out of God's pockets and then throw him off.
Yeah.
But it doesn't work like that. Mm-mm. You cannot do it. It will not work. You can't keep the fruit without the root.
Yeah, I think communism is a classic example. I mean, look, Stalin's willing to, create the man-made famine in the Ukraine and starve people to death.
Well, yeah, and
Mao killed all those millions of people in China. Pol Pot.
I mean, you go to Russia. The Russians will tell you themselves. Go to certain areas in Moscow. Fall flat on your face on the ground, and the people around you are more likely to try to steal your wallet mm-hmm. because you fell down than they are to try to help you.
Yeah,
that's the legacy of Marxism and communism. Mm-hmm. They
devalue human life.
Human life is devalued. Stalin tried to eradicate
piece of the system.
Stalin tried to eradicate the cultural Christian roots that were in Russia, and Stalin went to a monastery. Stalin was mm-hmm. in training to be a monk, and then he read. Guess what? What do you think he read?
Darwin.
Origin
of Species.
Origin of Species, and that opened his eyes, and he realized, I don't need to be a monk. I need to become
a revolutionary.
Yes. Yes.
So. My goodness. And so, here's Richard Dawkins, bless his heart. You desire for Richard Dawkins to get saved. And one thing you can appreciate about him is he is, like you say, he's up front, he's honest. I mean, I saw him, somebody mentioned to me the other day, John Lennox, and John Lennox has a form of theistic evolution.
He's another like Timothy Keller type, biologos type person.
And I
don't know if
Dawkins just destroy him in a video.
Yeah, I don't know if Lennox is quite as far, toward evolution as biologos, but I think he is some type of old earther, at least, if not a theistic evolutionist.
Well, in the clip I saw, he said, now let me get this, Dawkins said, let me get this straight. I'm paraphrasing here. Adam and Eve were made in the image of God, but what about Adam's parents?
Uh-huh.
Were they not in the image of God?
Yeah.
And Lennox couldn't answer it, and he was stumped. So here was you're trying to use theistic evolution.
It doesn't work.
And then somebody said, what about Adam's mom and dad? Were they created in the image of God?
No, they weren't.
How did he get created in the image of God?
So this is something that the
theistic evolution doesn't work.
Well, there's a guy by the name of William Lane Craig, Dr. William Lane Craig, used to be a really good Christian apologist. But over the years, he has gotten more and more compromised to the point that now he is, full on teaching that Adam and Eve had parents and those parents weren't human. That's his most recent book.
They were humanoid?
They were humanoid. They were like humans, but they weren't fully human, and they would not have been, according to Craig, in the image of God, full human.
Wow.
But nonetheless, Adam and Eve had parents, according to Craig.
Yeah, see, that just doesn't work.
And he calls
biblically, I mean, would death come in before the fall and everything?
And he calls Genesis mytho-history.
Mytho-history, that's crazy.
But here's what concerns me Would you say that that is compatible with biblical inerrancy at all?
No.
No. We
Yeah.
talked about inerrancy at church,
Yeah.
but it's not worth the paper it's written on if you don't uphold it.
Yeah, because when you start going into theistic evolution and you start having Adam and Eve having parents, and you open up a can of worms.
It's a big can of worms.
And
It's not compatible with biblical inerrancy. You cannot say Genesis is mytho-history, and then
when does it quit being mytho-history?
Exactly when?
When,
I don't
at
know.
what point? Is it at the time of Isaiah? Is it Malachi?
Yeah, and
Or does it go into Luke and Mark, Luke, John?
for Christian seminaries to tolerate this type of thing, who have in their statement of faith that they accept the Chicago Statement on Inerrancy, and then they
That's
allow
a problem.
They allow
I did not
this
realize.
stuff.
That is a problem.
Yeah,
That's a problem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But there's a good article on Answers in Genesis. I want to pull it up because William Lane Craig made a certain comment. Oh, we can come back to that.
Okay.
But he made a certain comment about Genesis and his reasoning that I think is very telling as to what's going on here. So
Yeah, I'm pretty shocked about that, and it just, to me, I think people just get to the point where they feel like if they can make some concessions, they can reach people,
yeah,
and I just don't think that's wise. It just never happens like that.
yeah.
So he says, I think, William Lane Craig, doesn't he promote a reasonable faith? Is that what?
Yeah, reasonable faith. And I even have one of William Lane Craig's books.
Yeah.
It's a fantastic book. It's called On Guard.
Yeah.
It's a really good guide to some good philosophical arguments. Even in that book, he does talk about the Big Bang and stuff, which I don't agree with. But he used to be doing some really solid apologetics. But yeah, here's what he says. Here's what William Lane Craig says about mytho-history.
All right.
I'm not using the word myth in the popular sense of falsehood, but rather in the folklorist sense of a traditional, sacred narrative explaining how the world and humanity came to be in their present form. History is a narrative concerning real people and events, and so a mytho-history would be a sort of fusion of the two, a narrative concerning real people and events told in the language of myth, in order to ground a culture's identity and institutions in events of the primordial past.
Okay.
Now that's a big load of words to basically say that he's trying to have his cake and eat it too. And one of the reasons that he supports this concept, he claims, is quote unquote fantastic elements in the text. And so somebody asked him about that, and he says, I define fantastic elements as those which, if taken literally, are so extraordinary as to be palpably false. Myths are typically characterized by these sorts of fantastic elements. For example, in the Mesopotamian myth, the Epic of Gilgamesh, there's a story of how the Bull of Heaven, that is the constellation Taurus, comes down to earth and rampages through the town of Uruk, until Gilgamesh and his cohort grab the bull by its tail, slay it, and distribute its meat to the town's citizens.
So what does that have to do with the Bible?
Similarly, the primordial history of Genesis 1 through 11 includes elements which, if taken literally, would be so extraordinary as to be clearly false. Take, for example, magical trees with fruit that, if eaten, would impart the knowledge of good and evil or immortality, or the presence of a talking snake that tempts the man and woman to sin.
Man,
so
that
this
sounds like
is a man who
a big load of unbelief right there.
Yeah, and this is a man who teaches a Bible study at a Southern Baptist church.
That's pretty.
So
that's pretty shocking. Yeah, I mean that's just I think just another way of saying, well, I don't believe this.
I don't believe this.
I
it's
just
fantastic.
don't believe. But we're going to call it this, and we're going to sanctify it.
Yeah.
To make it look like we're still okay.
This is the language that you would hear Richard Dawkins use.
Yes, I don't think Richard Dawkins have a problem with any of that.
No. So
Genesis 1 through 11. Now that's we're talking about we're talking about creation. We're talking about the fall.
The
we're talking
flood.
about the flood.
It's
we're
always
talking about
Genesis.
We're talking about the Tower of Babel.
Yeah.
We're talking about everything that's so foundational to having an understanding to the rest of the book.
Yes.
So what's foundational to the understanding of the rest of the book is just made up.
Exactly.
That's
It's mytho-history.
that's ridiculous.
Yeah.
I mean, I could that's stunning that he holds to that, but he's terribly wrong.
I mean, I'll tell you something else fantastical. In a different
man dying and coming back from the dead
in a different place in the
and
Bible,
then being resurrected.
You've got a
and
man
ascending into heaven.
Yeah, you have a man who claims to be God. He gets crucified, and then somehow he comes back from the dead.
That's fantastic.
That sounds pretty fantastical.
That sounds very fantastic.
And you know what else happens? He turns water into wine.
Yeah.
He feeds 5,000 people with how many fish?
5 loaves and 2 fish.
Yeah, not very
Jesus
many.
made a miracle dish.
So to me, that sounds rather fantastical. So maybe if we would use this type of reasoning, we could agree that the whole Bible is just mytho-history. Yeah.
Yeah, and we're talking about the book of Revelation. We're talking about final judgment books and the Lamb's Book of Life.
It all sounds rather fantastical, doesn't it?
Man, well, I think...
somehow Dr. Craig, in all of his wisdom, has bought into the secular mindset of anti-supernaturalism. Basically the idea that, well, if it sounds fantastical, if it's supernatural, it couldn't have happened.
Yeah.
That's the worldview of the atheist.
You could even take the very existence of the nation of Israel, the Jews having to come through everything they've been through in the last 2,000 years and being able to constitute themselves as a nation in 1948 and maintain themselves as a nation since.
Yeah.
That's pretty
fantastic.
It is.
I'll tell you something.
I don't know that really happened.
I'll tell you something that I have realized recently from doing some reading, and it's kind of opened my eyes to some things about the Bible, where the Bible records something that is absolutely true, but the way it records it, sometimes by necessity, because, we're talking about books from thousands of years ago that used to be transferred on parchment, written in a different language, written at a vastly different time.
Yeah.
So, okay, but the point I'm getting at is, it'll record something, but it won't necessarily go into a ton of detail about what happened. It just says this happened.
Right.
And if it's a supernatural thing, when you just read it, it sounds fantastic. It sounds so crazy and fantastical. But then if you were to just know more detail and more context, I'm not saying it wouldn't be a miracle, but I'm saying it wouldn't come across quite so fantastical if you just had more information.
Right.
Does that make sense? I'm not, miracles happen, but you and I could watch a miracle happen and it would seem totally real to us and not fantastical because we saw it with our own eyes and we saw the context of it. Whereas, then if we went and told somebody else and just said, well, this happened, then that person might say to us, well, that's fantastical. I don't believe that. And so, for example, in the book of Acts, I believe it's Herod, Acts records that Herod, he started accepting worship, right?
Yeah, and
and what happens?
With worms.
Well, in the book of Acts, it says he falls down and dies. He's eaten by worms, and he dies. And it doesn't give you much detail. And so when you just read that without the context or detail, because it's kind of just skimming over that.
Right.
And so when you just read it, the picture you build in your mind is, okay, he's standing there, he says some blasphemous thing, or he accepts worship, and then, boom, instantly, he falls down and dies, and is eaten by worms right there on the spot, which sounds kind of fantastical, because you don't see that type of thing happen all the time, right?
Right.
And I'm not saying that's impossible. With God, anything is possible. But in the history of the church, Eusebius, he actually gives us more detail on that event than what you read in the book of Acts.
Right.
And what he says is that what actually happened is he contracted, because the Bible doesn't tell us how long it took him to die. It just says that he died.
Right.
Well, Eusebius tells us that what Herod really did, what actually happened in that situation, is that Herod got intestinal worms. And he actually laid in bed for days and days, slowly dying of a parasite infestation. And he did die of worms. He got eaten by worms. That's true. What the Bible said is true. But if you were there to witness it, it wasn't as quote unquote fantastical as you might picture in your mind. He got sick, he had an infection, and he died.
Yeah.
That's what happened.
Right.
Does that make sense? Like,
yes.
The way that the Bible records something, sometimes in our modern mindset, we read it, we don't have context, and it kind of comes across unnecessarily fantastical, when if we just had more detail and more context, we wouldn't necessarily think of it that way. Does that make sense?
Right.
And I think if you and I could stand in the Garden of Eden and see with our own eyes what was happening with that talking snake, I'm not saying there wasn't a talking snake. I believe there was, because that's what the Bible says. But I don't think it would necessarily look like a fairy tale.
No.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yes.
I think it would look very real. So
yeah, and so what you have is when you come at the Bible and you say, well, I've got to make the Bible where modern people will believe it.
Yeah.
So I need to adjust the Bible. And you're taking the wrong approach. Let's see what the Bible says.
Yeah.
And now let's explain it to the modern people.
Yeah.
And let's come from the Bible to the people, not the people to the Bible.
Yeah. And when the Bible says that the snake talked, does it mean that its mouth moved and actual sound came from its mouth, or does it mean that Satan spoke directly into the minds of Adam and Eve?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't really know. Do you have an opinion on that?
Yeah, there's a lot going on right now with a lot of folks. I mean, with some of these people that are really delving into the first 11 chapters of Genesis. I mean, they are finding a treasure trove of incredible stuff.
Right.
I mean, they're going back over Genesis 6. There are, all that's associated with the time before the flood and everything, and what that would look like, even in the Garden of Eden. And it is fascinating, man. And I think the Bible is to be trusted. I think it's true. And, if the snake looked a little bit different, I know he was different after the fall. God cursed the snake, and there's some things must have happened a little bit differently, after the fall than before the fall. And we don't know everything that there is to know. There's so much that we don't know, but here's what we do know, and here's what the Bible tells us.
Yeah.
And so we have to say, there's stuff that we don't know about this, but here's what the Bible does tell us, and it makes sense. It shows itself out throughout the pages of Scripture. When it comes to the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis, I mean, I think it's crucial that we believe those chapters of the Bible. I think they're literal.
Yeah.
I think they're telling us, they're not telling us everything that happened or how everything completely was, but here's what we do know, and we can take that, and we can kind of go from there. But anyway, well, Paul, if you could say just a brief little paragraph to Richard Dawkins. And Richard, if you're listening out there, this is from the irrepressible Paul Price.
Well, I mean, to Richard Dawkins, like I said, Richard has gone on record saying there's no piece of evidence that would convince him. And if that's not the definition of being closed-minded, I don't know what is. So I would say that you need to have a system where it's possible for you to change your mind on the basis of evidence. It's if you want to say, I reject God because there's no evidence, then you can't at the same time hold a position where all potential evidence is excluded, right? You have to be able to accept evidence.
Yes.
And so, that's the problem there. You've developed a system where you've protected yourself from the very possibility of accepting God. And that sounds more like a spiritual problem than an intellectual problem.
You're exactly right. Well, that's a good word for Richard Dawkins. Well, we want to thank you all for being with us on the Uncensored Pilgrims podcast. We hope you have a great day, and we will see you next time. And we need to let you know that the views that we express on this podcast belong to Marty McLain and Paul Price. They are our views. They do not reflect the views of anyone else. And with that said, we hope you have a great week, and we'll see you next time on the podcast.